A very good morning to all of you. And my senior and respected in the service, Shri Sethi, Dr. Sharma, who gave me the opportunity to come and speak to you, the representatives of the Indian Association for Air Pollution Control, the officials of ONGC, and others who have sponsored this event. Let me first, once again, wish you a very good morning and thank you for coming to this event and speak to you on an issue that is gaining importance every day as we go along. It almost sounds like a war cry, net zero. Every economy has to become net zero in terms of emissions by such and such date. So there are countries which have announced by 2050, there are some who have done it by 2060. And our own Prime Minister took the entire world by surprise when he announced a net zero goal for India by 2070. This was a very positive announcement. In fact, it electrified the entire international community when he said this, because nobody had expected this to happen. India has already announced very ambitious goals for 2030. That is the legal obligation under the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015. So every single country, including India, has already given very, very ambitious goals, set ambitious goals for itself under the Paris Agreement, and we have also done. But those of you who have been following the Prime Minister's announcements in Glasgow last year must have realized that he added two things there. We already have an emissions intensity goal, emissions intensity of GDP goal, to reduce it by 35%. He raised it to 45% by 2030. We have another goal of energy transition in terms of renewables, share of renewables in our electricity generation capacity, which is 40%. He raised it to 50% by 2030. And he added this on the cream on the pie was this net zero announcement. So the question today is how significant this is, how difficult it is, and what does it imply for the entire industry. The one thing, so I'll try and explain this in two parts. One is the global dimension and the other one is the national, the domestic dimension, the implications of net zero for you. At the global level, what is important to understand that this talk about net zero did not happen more than 5-6 years ago. They started gaining international currency only from 2015 onwards. So in the last 7 years, what has happened actually that is motivating the entire international, the community to move towards net zero? Under the Paris Agreement, the goal is stabilize the climate at 2 degrees below the pre-industrial level, the temperature rise to be contained at not more than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. After the Paris Agreement, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the largest scientific body in the world which is dealing with climate change scientific issues, it recommended that the world must stabilize the climate at 1.5 degree, not 2 degree. If we really have to avert the climate crisis in a short time, and if we don't want to reach the tipping point of no return, the climate crisis is deepening every day. The kind of disasters which we see around every day, it's increasing in manifold and magnitude. So if we don't have to go there, we must do something urgently and stabilize the climate even earlier, not at 2 degree, not wait for 2 degree, just limit it at 1.5 degree. But that obviously means something more, which means that the world must reduce, the IPCC recommends that the world must reduce its carbon, the emissions, all kinds of emissions, including carbon emissions, by at least 45% by 2030. You see, we are already in the year 2022. We just have 8 more years. And today, the global emissions is 52 gigatons. Now 52 gigatons has to be brought down by 45% in the next 8 years. This is a mammoth task. This is one of the recommendations of the IPCC. And the second recommendation was that by 2050, the world must bring it down to zero. So we have about another 28 years to bring the world emissions down to zero. So does net zero actually mean zero, or does it mean something more than that? The notions of net zero actually range very widely. This can include net zero carbon emissions, net zero GHG emissions, carbon neutrality, so deep decarbonization. All of these basically refer to the same thing, but there are different ways of approaching the problem. And we have to devise our own method. And in India, I'll come to that shortly, what is it that we need to do? So the other thing which I would like to tell you at the global level, the other issue, there are actually three important issues attached with the issue of net zero. One is that the net zero emission includes not just carbon emissions, but all greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases are, after carbon dioxide, there is methane, there is nitrous oxide. These are also substantial. In fact, methane comes from rice cultivation and livestock. And that is, the fulcrum of the entire economic stability of a country like ours, a developing country. So this is an issue of food security. So there are other gases which also impinge on our developmental policies. So it's important to understand that when we talk of net zero emissions, we don't talk only of carbon, but of other gases also which have impact on the food security and economic security of the country. The second part is that if we talk about net zero at the global level, does it mean that every single country has to achieve net zero? No. Actually, the global compact is, under the Paris Agreement, is that the developed world, which has caused climate change because of its excessive emissions in the past, must take responsibility and must reduce its emissions faster than others. So the second implication of net zero at the global level is that the developed countries must reduce their emissions faster and deeper. Today, you will be surprised to know that in most of the developed economies, except a few Scandinavian countries and UK and maybe one or two others, the world emissions are still rising. As per the United Nations Convention, they were supposed to have peaked their emissions in 1990. That was way back, 30 years ago. And they are still rising. So that is the travesty of the entire agreement, that despite the fact that the world has taken on a global commitment to achieve net zero, the developed countries which are responsible for climate change, they are still growing their emissions. But they have to make conscious efforts to ensure that the world emissions decline. So that is the second issue. And the third issue is that even if the carbon emissions are brought down to zero, it doesn't become zero, because there is methane, there is nitrous oxide. And carbon emissions will also not go down unless we decarbonize the industry completely. Because industry needs carbon, it needs coal, it needs fossil fuels for different kinds of fuels. Now, those different kinds of fuels, can we replace it completely with renewable energy, completely with solar power, wind power, or hydrogen maybe in the future? That is a matter of technology, and it is also a matter of scientific, technical, as well as economic feasibility. So I'll come to that. So there are these three main issues at the global level. Now, let us understand what happens to India if we follow this net zero goal by 2070. The first issue, in the context of net zero scenario, the first question that needs to be settled is the dateline by which India can actually peak its emissions. We have still not peaked our emissions. So where is the question of reaching net zero? Unless we know the trajectory of our emissions, we are still a growing country. We are in the growing phase. Our emissions are bound to grow. Our energy consumption is growing day by day. And no country in the world has actually developed to reached a developed status without having consumed energy or raised its per capita energy consumption up to a substantive level. So we are still much behind that level. So when do we reach that level of a reasonable degree of energy consumption which ensures livelihoods, better incomes, better facilities to all our citizens of the country. And that is not like to be reached before 2050 or maybe even 2060. There are, the economic modeling suggests that the $12,500, which is the criteria for declaring a country developed, that level is not likely to be reached by India until 2050. Maybe if we start growing at a very fast pace, we can accelerate the transition faster and we reach that status. But it is, by all accounts, it appears that that level will not be reached in the immediate future. And therefore, we have to think of a deadline by which we can actually peak our emissions. Coal is the major source of our carbon emissions in the country. Coal, fossil fuel in transport, liquid fuels, and some others. Can we bring the consumption of coal in the power sector and other sectors like steel, cement, where they're used for high-grade heat? Can we bring it down to zero? Or can we actually stabilize that consumption and peak the emissions? By which year can this happen? So the first question which we have to understand for a net zero economy is to understand the peaking of our emissions. When is it that we can actually phase out coal completely? You must have, those of you who are following the climate discussions, must have come to know that at Glasgow, this was a major point of debate. And prior to Glasgow, the ministers of power and ministers of environment met in the G20 forum, and they heatedly debated this issue. And finally, the word phase out had to be replaced by the word phase down. Because countries like India and China and South Africa, which are still growing, they cannot phase out coal completely in the immediate future. They need greater time frame. So the first question is peaking of emissions. And the peaking of emissions has a subset, coal emissions. When is it that we can actually peak? There are the people who are optimists. They are saying that we can do this faster. We can do this in 2035. We can do this in 2040. But it's all a matter of conjecture. So the second issue is for the net zero at the economy-wide level is that it cannot be achieved only by planning for carbon-free electricity. A recent study which we carried out in TERI, and we said that for a net zero emission scenario in the Indian energy sector alone, even if we achieve full carbon neutrality in the energy sector, which means power sector, electricity sector, even if we replace all our coal plants with renewable power, like wind and solar and offshore wind and hydrogen, we will still have huge amount of residual carbon emissions in the system in 2050. And this is not some matter of conjecture. This is actually the energy modeling data which suggests this. Because the entire power grid system needs base load, and that base load comes from coal. Unless we have full access to nuclear or hydrogen or hydropower has its own limitations. Nuclear has its own limitations. Solar is growing. Variable cost of solar is falling, but we don't have the base load system there unless we have energy storage. So that is a critical factor. So the modeling suggests that in 2050 or 2060, we will still have very large quantum of carbon emissions in the system, despite the fact that even if we fully make energy transition towards renewables. So to do that, what do we do? And that is the third issue of net zero emissions, that we have to actually resort to carbon capture and storage. We actually have to store the carbon underground to be able to say that we have reached net zero. Or we sequester the carbon in forests by planting more trees. So these are the two ways in which we can say that we have net zero, despite the fact that the emissions are growing, they exist. These emissions are neutralized either by planting more trees, through carbon sequestration, or through actual carbon storage. Now, again, there are technological and economic issues there. So the energy, transport, agriculture, and industry are the four carbon-intensive sectors of Indian economy. Except in case of energy, or where such transition is possible today, full neutrality in other sectors may not be technologically difficult, but economically challenging. So in the interest of net zero goal, it is therefore useful for India to first look at the carbon neutrality of those carbon intensive sectors where such possibility exists, not at the economy-wide level, but at the sectoral level. Other remaining sectors can be encouraged to move towards low carbon trajectory through a long-term growth strategy which can use appropriate economic and regulatory instruments. And in fact, if you look at the Paris Agreement, it doesn't talk about net zero strategy. The word net zero doesn't exist in Paris Agreement. The word net zero came, as I said, because of the recommendations of the IPCC, and the first time it appears in any of the climate decisions was at Glasgow. And so we have to look at what is it that we need to do. Do we need to make a net zero commitment at the economy-wide level or at the sectoral level where it is economically feasible and technically feasible? So the first sector which we can actually target is the power sector. Power sector has shown the potential of reaching carbon neutrality without further fiscal or regulatory concessions. In this sector, carbon neutrality depends on two things: overall growth of energy demand and our ability to replace coal with alternative energy. Now, the system cost of solar energy has fallen in the recent years, but it has to be combined with the energy storage technologies. If the combined cost of energy storage and the renewable generation becomes competitive with that of the coal produced power by 2030 or by 2035, it may then be technically possible to put a cap on the coal emissions and say that we can reach our peak. Currently, coal meets almost more than 65% of India's energy requirement. In the event of coal going out of the energy system by 2035, the current target of 500 gigawatts of renewable energy will still not be adequate to replace it fully. The renewable capacity generation has to rise to the extent of 80 to 90% of this capacity by 2035 to be able to meet all our energy needs. Can this happen? The current penetration of renewable energy is just about 42% in terms of capacity, but only 12% in terms of actual generation. So as energy demand by 2050, 2060 or 2070 is likely to go by 4 to 5 times, the renewable energy capacity will also need to be scaled up by that amount. And our energy modeling suggests that it is likely to be in the range of 6,000 gigawatts by 2050. Our current target is just 500, mind you. This is a massive, mammoth figure. So shutdown of since we are talking about coal, another issue is that of just transition. Shutdown of coal plants or replacement of coal plants with renewable energy sources gives rise to the question of loss of livelihoods and incomes of people and the states. The states are a very important stakeholder. India will therefore need to mount a massive program for reskilling the existing workers and employers and redeploying them productively in other sectors of the economy. Now let me come to the industries. We have talked about the power sector and the coal so far. About 30% of emissions in India come from the use of fuels and processes in industry. Another 15% comes from transport. Now, for replacing the use of coal and liquid fuels in hard-to-abate industries like steel, cement, aluminum, metallurgy, petroleum, petrochemicals, and long-distance transport like civil aviation, shipping, trucking, we have to switch to application of hydrogen and energy storage at economical scale. Currently, the hydrogen is almost 3 times costlier than the other sources of renewable energy. And use of natural gas as traditional fuel, a transitional fuel, may not be economical, as it will raise the cost of materials and affect also our export competitiveness. And in fact, the European countries are today debating whether natural gas can be adopted as a transitional fuel at all. They call it dirty fuel. Despite the fact that there is a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, the Europeans are still talking about avoiding natural gas, which is the only option available to them. There are countries like France still insist on nuclear, but the countries like Germany are opposing that option. So there is a big debate going on. So natural gas is not only a matter of environmental debate, it's also a matter of economics. Can it actually supplant the conventional fuels as the transitional fuels. The second option is that of hydrogen. Since we all know that we have a national hydrogen mission, which is a very positive thing to do, ultimately we have to move forward to better technologies and better alternative sources of clean fuels. So we have to look at hydrogen. But it appears that green hydrogen could be available at economical costs by late 2040s. There are major hydrogen manufacturers today have made announcements about further investments in this sector. So hopefully it will catch up. But advancement of this technology and its associated infrastructure in terms of production, storage, distribution at massive scale is still a matter of development. As these technologies in steel and other relevant sectors are held under IPR by the global majors, India will naturally have to ask for creation of an international platform, including the governments, corporates, which can help develop and disseminate these technologies in our country at a faster rate. So that is the second question. Green hydrogen economy will also need demand of green products, demand for green hydrogen. Now, where is the demand for green hydrogen going to come from? Only from the industrial sources. And today the industries find it is cheaper, and the business models actually govern that. The options for fuels are governed by the economic choices, not by environmental choices, unless there are clear-cut regulations. Now, there is no regulation. So unless we have a regulation in place which suggests that certain specific types of industries must use green hydrogen, it is not going to happen. I understand that government is actively considering this. Hopefully this will happen in certain specific industries. But that is really an important issue. So we need to create a demand for green products in the system so that the green hydrogen gets picked up. Now, the other thing is financing. I mean, all this, which we have talked about, different kinds of options, different kinds of transitions in different sectors of economy, all this actually requires investment and finance. Where is this money going to come from? Either from the domestic sources of our budget or our private sector investments, or from international sources. Now, I have spent at least last 10 to 15 years looking at the way the climate discourse is developing. I have absolutely no hope that there will be international mobilization of funds for climate to meet the needs of developing countries like India. We have to actually meet this entire requirement from our own sources. International capital is available. There is no dearth of capital. But the issue is, fundamentally, the issue is that of the cost of capital. We don't have systems in the international markets which will make green finance or climate finance available to industry and our investors at rates that are affordable. If the capital comes with a cost which is unaffordable, obviously it will not go to greener investments. So that is the real issue. What kind of structure we can evolve at the global level and maybe within the country also, so that our financial system makes green finance, climate finance available to investors, to the industry, so that they are incentivized to make investment there. Finally, let me conclude by saying that the call for 2070 goal for net zero emissions should not result in complacency. 2070 is still far away. But the fact that we have a net zero goal before us should actually become a driving force for making this transition in as early time frame as possible. We will need investments, we will need technologies, and we will need clear targets in terms of policies and regulations. Policies and regulations, the problem is that there is normally a fiscal or financial resource allocation involved, which governments are reluctant to do because it affects their ability to make economic choices. And today, the governments all over the world, and more so particularly in our country, they are faced with so many developmental problems. Environmental concern is one of them. So they have to grapple with these choices at the policy making level. They have to decide whether to allocate resources for purpose A or purpose B. We have a net zero goal in 2070, but that should not lead us to think that we can reach 2070, the goal in 2070 on our own. It is not going to happen. The fact that we have been able to achieve the energy intensity of our GDP and we have been able to reduce substantially. In fact, the data suggests that we have already reduced it by 24% in 2016 compared with our 45% goal. But that should not lead us to complacency. We must have economic regulations and policies in place, even if it costs us. So we have to be prepared to field these costs and make these transitions not only in the power sector, but across all sectors. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much for listening to me and giving